Hi and welcome to another training video, and today's video is going to be on business intelligence, and we're going to start off with a presentation covering some of the definitions of business intelligence and some of the things that people need to be aware of when planning a business intelligence project. We're then going to pause and take a look at a couple of different tools that can be used commonly, one of them being Excel, and we're going to look at all the power tools within Excel, so Power Pivot, Power View, Power Query, and Power Maps. And finally, we're going to have a look at Power BI Desktop. Now, this is going to be a long video, and so I will put links below so you can skip ahead to any of the areas that particularly interest you. So let's have a start with our presentation. And information and intelligence are very different things. People often confuse them. They think if they have a lot of information, then that's a lot of intelligence. Information is not intelligence. Today's world, we talk about big data, and big data can be from a huge number of different sources, particularly where we have what we call machine-generated data. We can quite quickly end up with tens of millions of records. So we're not talking about hundreds or thousands of rows of data, and some people do tell me that they've got a really big Excel spreadsheet. It's got about 600 rows in it. We're talking about tens of millions of records to be considered big data, but realistically anything over about 50,000 records should be considered as big data and treated the same. When we have this data, like I say, it can be machine generated. It ends up in a variety of different file formats, and we could store it in different ways as well. So sometimes it's stored in CSV files, sometimes it's stored in Excel, quite often it's stored in a database, and quite often our entire data set or data model will be stored in a variety of different formats across the organization. And there is the age-old problem of data duplication, particularly where, and we have clients who do this all the time, they email each other the data files, and they then produce reports using the data file and just filtering down the data to show the report that they want. Just to be clear about this, a report or a summary is done using the data or from the data, but not with the data. In other words, you don't filter the data to produce your report. You produce a report linked to the data, but it leaves the data alone as data. Similar to if you create a chart in Excel, the chart is linked to the data and driven by the data, but if you do anything to the chart, it does not affect the data. We end up with data overload. We have so much data, so many different sorts of data, so many different locations for it to be stored, and at the end of the day, we need to think about who it is who's going to be processing this data. And there might be Homer Simpson with a little monkey clapping away symbols inside his head, and yeah, we have lots of other distractions from the data as well. We need to simplify it to make it easy for us to understand. Data is information. That's the part of what I said is not intelligence. Somebody once likened this to taking a drink from a fire hydrant. Just imagine sitting in front of a fire hydrant with your mouth open and someone turns the fire hydrant on. You're not just going to take a little sip of water. It's the data analysis that gives us the business intelligence, not the data itself. Now, the first thing we need to do is ask ourselves some questions when we're looking at this. So we need to ask, first of all, what is it that we want to analyze? And by this I mean, what business process do we need to analyze? Once we know what business process, we then say, where is the associated data? Not all of our data, just the data that's relevant to that process that we're analyzing. The other thing that a lot of people forget is, when is the decision point that this analysis will influence? So the analysis, the summary that we produce, will be presumably for some executive somewhere, and they will be using it to influence a decision that they have to make. Now, if they need to make that decision by tomorrow, there's no point in us spending a week getting the perfect data summary to put in front of them, because they will have already had to make the decision by then without the benefit of the intelligence. We then have to ask, how is the analysis going to be presented? Will it just be on my screen? Will I just go up to the executive's office and open my laptop and show them something perhaps in Excel? Will I email it to them as an Excel file? Or will the audience be bigger? Will this need to be put in front of shareholders before a meeting? In which case, what kind of information will they be able to access? What information will they be able to understand? And what devices will they be using to look at it? And tied in with this is who will be presenting it. So again, if you're putting it in front of a wider public audience, perhaps the data analyst themselves is not the best person to present it, and it might be worth getting somebody else in who understands presentations rather than the data analyst. Okay, let's think about this as a business process project. So the first thing about the project is, what business process exactly are we trying to analyze? The next step is, how are we going to measure the process? In other words, what figures do we need to match? What targets do we already have that we want to find the figures related to be able to tell whether this process is working efficiently or not? Once we've decided that, we then need to build a data model. So we need to find the various different sources of data. We need to merge them together in such a way that they can be related. And we might need to add in extra calculations here as well. Once we've done all of that, we then need to build some kind of summary, some kind of report or a dashboard which we'll put in front of whoever's going to make the decision. And finally, this needs to be shared with that person who is going to make the decision, so that having the best dashboard in the world is not actually that much use if it's confined to your own machine and you can't share it with anybody else. Now, if we think of this in terms of a project, we actually have various different phases of the project. So the first thing is the scope definition. So this covers the first two of these steps, and it is deciding what the project is going to be about. This is probably going to be done by some kind of strategist within the organization. This itself leads on to the development, which is building the data model and building the dashboards. This is done by the data analyst, data manager, probably the people who are listening to this presentation. The final step is presenting or making a decision, and actually they happen at the same time, because one person presents, or a team will present, and the audience there will be making the decision pretty much on the spot at that point in time. And this may be done by some form of executive within the organization, vice president putting it in front of the president, for example. Let's look at a quick example here. So as a supermarket, the business process that we want to analyze might be checkout sales, and we want to make a measurement in amounts of money, and we want to make this per till and per cashier, but we may not be able to make it with that level of granularity. We may need to make it by make of till and by category of cashier, depending on how big the organization is. When we drill down into the data, we can then make it by these lower levels, and so a regional manager might be able to look at this data by individual cashiers or by individual tills. For our example, we're going to look at it by makes of till and by categories of cashier, where the cashiers are either new cashiers, medium-term employees, or long-term employees. And once we know these two things, we're going to build our data model. Now, the schema for our data model is going to involve two different types of tables, or two different types of information. The first is going to be fact information. Now, our fact table is built from the tills. So the till transactions themselves become our fact table, and there's certain events that are recorded on them. So actually every single item that gets scanned is recorded by our till as a separate fact. They then all combine together into a single invoice or single transaction number when the customer pays. Now, there's other related information that's stored at the same time, but it links to or refers to other existing tables, and these tables become what's known as dimension tables or lookup tables. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. The till information over on the left, this is things like the date and time stamp, the till ID and the cashier ID. Now the cashier ID comes from the cashier signing into that till. When the items are scanned through the till, they then record the product ID and the quantity of those items, and then when the customer eventually pays at the end of swiping all the items, the customer ID is picked up from their loyalty card and their payment type is recorded, and a transaction ID is generated for all of the items. So we end up with those three stages there: the stuff that's known at the start of the transaction, and then all of the individual swiped items that go through, and then finally the customer information. But we can't leave it like this because this is inconsistent data. We need to actually fill all the fields down so that each line is consistent, and this is done automatically in the tills. This then becomes our fact table, which is central and is surrounded by lookup tables. Now each of these lookup tables needs to have some kind of relationship with the fact table. So the relationships are built by having what's called common columns, and for example here we have cashier IDs in our transactions fact table, and in the lookup table we also have cashier IDs. Now in the lookup table they are unique values, so there can only be one of that number in the cashier lookup table, but there may be many of that number in the fact table because each cashier will swipe many items through the till. Going on to others, the product lookup table works in the same way. Within our product lookup table we only have one of each product ID, but each item can be purchased more than once. So for example we have 2, 3, 4 of each item, perhaps even within each transaction. The payment type lookup table, the till lookup table, and the customer lookup table all work in exactly the same way. The last one we have here is a calendar table, and this does work in a slightly different way because what it lets us do is set the levels by which we can group all of these transactions. So because we have, for example, days in here, we can group them by days of the week, so we can then get some kind of indication of how well our business process is performing by day of the week, or by month, or by year, and that's because we have this table here that we can use as a lookup. Now, the data itself doesn't necessarily give us all the information we want. Sometimes we have to create a calculation as well, and these are called measures within the Excel environment. Let's say, for example, we want to work out total sales per day per till. Now this is a sum of money and a number of items. So this is the thing that we need to measure, and this is operations who want us to measure this so that they can record the performance of the tills themselves. When they come to buy new tills, they can buy the ones that are performing best. Our HR department or staff management may want to do the same measures based upon cashiers or members of staff, and again we're doing this by the sum of the amount of money through the till and the number of items scanned through the till. For planning our stores, the new locations, we may want to take a look at the distance that the customers travel to our stores. Now if our customer ID table has customer addresses, we can then use some kind of analysis to see how far customers travel to get to our store. For stock control, clearly the same data model will give us a total number of items sold per day, and we can work out from that the current rate of sales of each item of stock. A couple of things that we can't do. We can't measure this against stock levels. We don't have that in our data model. We can't look at lead times, delivery times. We don't have any supplier information. And just-in-time cycle factors, we don't have that information in either. Now we could expand our data model, and the mistake a lot of people make is they think of it as the data model. It's not the data model, it is a data model, and it is a data model to look at the specific business process that we're looking at this point in time. So if it does need to be expanded, it can be, or another one can be created to measure a different business process. So this particular data model here, let's look at how we can create these calculations to work out our measurements or measures. First way is by doing calculated columns. So here we want to add a column into our fact table, which gives us the line sale price, which is the quantity of the items that were sold multiplied by the pack price of those items. Now within our fact table we have the quantity because that came up as the number of items that were scanned, but we don't have the pack price. But we do have the product ID, which links to the product lookup table, and in there, if we look up the particular product ID we're talking about, we can then get the pack price for that particular ID. So this becomes what we call a calculated column, and it adds in an extra item on every row within this table, which gives us the calculated value. Now, calculated columns are calculated for every single record, like I just said, every single row in that column. But there's another type of measure which are global measures, and they are absolute, so they're used across the entire data model. So in Excel, for example, a calculated column would be like a row total. So some relative reference of a number multiplied by another relative reference of a number in the same rows, and normally displayed on the right hand side of a row. And the column total, which would be generally the sum of the figures above, that just gives you a single figure. So the row totals give you multiple figures, one for every row, and the column total just gives you a single number. So that's the difference between a calculated column, think of that as a row total, and a measure, which is a single figure answer. An example here, calculated column is the rows, global measure would be the column total. Okay, when we come to presenting the data, we need to think about how this is built. So it's probably built by the developer, by the data analyst, but it may be modified by the end user. So what the data analyst produces might not be exactly how the end user wants to display it. And by end user, I'm talking about either the person giving the presentation or the person receiving the presentation. It must inform the business process, and it must be simple and easy to understand. I'm not saying simplistic, but it must be simple to understand, and it must clearly highlight the differences between the objects being compared. Should be dynamic, should be able to refresh based upon new data, and it should be interactive so it can be edited by the end user. Ideally it should be visual, much easier to compare two things in a chart than two numbers or 100 numbers in a grid. Ideally it should also be platform independent, and what I mean by that is if you're going to be putting it in front of shareholders, they should be able to view it on any device that they've got. So there are some problems if you save it as, for example, a PowerView report. Does the end user have Silverlight on their machine? Does their browser support Silverlight? Most of them don't nowadays. Ideally, again, you should allow drilling into the data so that the end user can verify the facts if they want to. Common tools that are used, Excel and Power BI Desktop. There's pros and cons for both. So pros for Excel is universal. Yeah, pretty much everybody does have it, but not everybody. It's familiar to most people, and it's relatively cheap because, as I said, most people already have it. The downsides are it's a spreadsheet. Even when using the power tools, it is still a spreadsheet. So although you have SQL queries running in the background, the front end is still a spreadsheet with all the limitations of a spreadsheet. There are sharing issues. I'm sure people are familiar with the sharing issues of sharing Excel files. Some features work, some don't. And equally, if you're sharing an Excel file which is linked to other data, does the customer or the receiver also have access to the locations where that data is stored? When we come to publishing, I mentioned Silverlight. Silverlight is needed for publishing some of the Excel power features, and Silverlight is not supported by new browsers such as Chrome. Moving across to Power BI Desktop, it's a database engine rather than a spreadsheet. This does mean certain things work much faster, so particularly when working with big data, some features work much faster processing the big data. There are methods that you can publish to a secure website, and you can then easily share with other people. It's very dynamic. There are lots of features within Power BI Desktop that are slicer features, so filter features, and pretty much anything that you click on becomes a filter or a slicer. It's reported to be the main effort for Microsoft at the moment, and you can see this, that they are putting a lot of effort into developing it and adding new features pretty much all the time. Negatives: it's an additional app. This may sound like it's not a problem, but for some business environments it is a problem. You may have to get special permissions from IT or similar to actually get it installed on your machine in the first place, even though it is a free app, the Power BI Desktop free version. It is very much still under development. There are new features coming into it all the time. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but in the early days obviously it is. But if they carry on developing at the same rate, then that will become a very good thing. If you want to publish, if you want to use some of the sharing features, not all of them, but just some of them, you will need the Pro version, and that then involves a subscription and licensing. Okay, the first of these power tools is Excel that we're going to take a look at. So Excel involves a lot of different parts making up the power tools. Some of them are really quite good. In fact, a lot of them have led on to the development of Power BI Desktop. What most people don't realize is that a lot of these tools have been in Excel since 2010, just nobody's used them. Microsoft have a really bad habit of putting features into programs and not telling people about them. The other tool we'll take a look at is Power BI. Now, Power BI is probably the next big thing to do with data analysis, and I'm fully aware there are other products out there similar to Tableau and others. For the purpose of today's presentation, we're just going to look at Power BI and Excel. Okay, so let's start by taking a look at some of the tools in Excel. And we'll remind ourselves first of all about this analysis that we're going to do and ask the questions: what do we want to analyze? Where is the data? When is a decision point? How will the analysis be presented, and who will present it? So for our example with the supermarket, the process we're measuring is checkout sales. Our measurement we're making will be an amount of money that goes through the tills and by cashier. And as I said earlier, we're going to look at this by till make and cashier experience. And we're going to look at it as amounts of money and also as numbers of items through the till. So we are going to build our fact table and our data model. Now, we do have some information here. These are our lookup tables, so they're stored within this file as tables. We also have our fact table, which is stored. Here's an example of one of the CSV files, and it's basically storing comma separated values. In other words, a text file, very, very quick and easy to read by most other applications. And these are all dumped into a central location, transactions by year, as single CSV files. They may go in as multiple files. We have some software that links them all together into a single file. Now, there's no guarantee that other files might not end up in the same location. So when I get my data into Excel, into looking in this location, I need to exclude any other files that may be put in here at a future date, for example, backup files. Okay, let's go through the process in Excel of getting the information in. Sorry, we do have an additional file there, which is the store information, and that's also just a CSV file. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off in an Excel spreadsheet, and this is just a blank spreadsheet. I'm not going to open one of those files and then build it from that file. So I'm leaving all of those files untouched, and all I'm going to do is actually access them or read them into this Excel file, which will hold the summary. So in order to get the data in, what we're going to do first of all is go to Data, and we're going to make a new query. So we're going to use our query editor. We're going to say New Query, and we're going to choose From Folder. And we're going to go and look at that folder we were just looking at. And this particular one is on the desktop. So I'm going to browse to it. It's on my desktop. If I can find my desktop. And it's called Transactions by Year. Now, the machine is now having a look through everything in that folder, and it's giving me a quick summary here. So they are at the moment all CSV files. I have various different choices down here, and some of these do have drop downs underneath. I'm going to go straight in and edit first of all. I don't want to load them straight away, because remember I said there are some criteria. There may be extra files added into that folder at a later date. So in order to get around that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here and right click on the extension first of all, because they may also be added in with .csv in uppercase. So the first thing I want to do is transform all of these into lowercase. Now the important thing here is I have not done anything to the folder itself. I have not gone into the folder and changed them all into lowercase, because some other application might be looking at them and want them all in uppercase. All I've done is I've changed them in my view. So the view that I've imported, I'm looking at them all as if they were all lowercase. Now what happens over here on the right is I get a series of steps that get built up as I'm working. The next thing I want to do is I want to filter this so that it will only show me, or only import the CSV files. Now if I deselect that, when I just select CSV files, it actually interprets that as me selecting everything. And the reason is because I don't have any other file types in there at the moment. So what I actually need to do is I need to apply a text filter which says equals, and equals .csv, or I can choose from there because .csv is already one of the file formats in that folder. Okay, so now I've filtered using the file extensions, and all of this other details you see here, this is metadata. So I don't need to see any of the metadata anymore. I do just need to have a look at the content. So I'm simply going to say remove other columns and then expand the content. This will give me previews of the first of the files, gives me the first couple of 100 rows, and this is enough for the machine to then look at and make some analysis of the data types within each of these fields. I'm just going to click OK, and it will go ahead and combine them all. What I was checking for on that last screen was to see whether the headers have been promoted, which they had. So my headers have gone to the top, and it's picked up all the details. You'll also notice it's picked up the different types of data. So this has gone in as date time, and it has also gone in the UK date format. And the reason it's done that is because I have UK date format down here, but also because our till transactions did have UK date format on the tills. We have various other fields, and you notice on the left hand side these have all been picked up as number fields, even though these are referring to product IDs, which are actually product ID text codes rather than number codes. So we could go through and change them by simply clicking on there and changing them to text if we wanted to. We're not going to do that in this case. What we are going to do is simply say close and load to, because if we just say close and load, it will use the default settings. Now the default settings are what you see coming up in this box. So the default setting is it loads it up into my worksheet in a table. I don't want to do this. I don't want a table. I just want to create a connection, and I definitely want this added to the data model. So I click load, and that has now loaded up a single file, which will be my transactions file, and it has loaded it into the data model. Now Also, whenever any additional files are put into that location, when I refresh, I'll just do that while refreshing my queries here, that will recalculate. I can recalculate that specific one by clicking refresh on the actual query itself, but it will reassess the query and give me a new set of data to work on. Okay, let's have a look at getting information in from an Excel file. So we say from file from workbook, and the workbook we're going to look at is again on my desktop, and it's this one here, and there's a variety of different range areas or range objects within the file. So there's these tables here, and there are sheets here. Now you get to know what the different icons mean after a while, but these are the sheets with the different little tags on the bottom, and the ones with the blue bars at the top, these are tables. It will also pick out any print areas or any other region areas that you've got set within the Excel file. Now I actually want all of these tables to be selected. Now if I click on one, it just deselects the previous one I had selected, unless I say select multiple items. So then that allows me to select multiples. It does give me a preview of the last one I've got selected, and I'm going to say load to. I don't need to edit these, they're just tables, they don't have any metadata, they don't have file extensions for me to choose, and I'm going to say only create connection and add to the data model and load. I'm just waiting for this to finish. It's actually importing all that data, and we'll see that now all of those items are added into my data model. Now if I want to edit any one of these queries, I can just come across here and double click on it, and it will take me into the query editor to actually go and edit that query. Now let's take a look at how we can actually use what we've added into the data model. Now the first thing I'm going to have a look at is how these look when we try to use a pivot table. So I'm just going to click in an empty cell, and I'm going to say insert pivot table, just the same as I would do normally, but because I'm in an empty cell, not in a cell in a range of data, the data model is suggesting that I use the worksheet or the workbook's data model, and it's then asking me where to put it. So I'll put it a few rows down and click OK, and I'll just minimize down those queries for now. What we end up with is instead of just a list of fields, we end up with a list of all of the data sets and all of the fields within those data sets. Now within my transaction data, I have the quantity of items scanned through the till, but I don't anywhere have the value of those items, because that comes from the product ID and a related table products with the product ID and the pack price. So what I'd need to do is create some kind of relationship between these two items. Now where we do that is actually in our data model. So we need to go to Power Pivot and Manage, or we can go to Data and Manage, but we need to go into Manage the data model. And what we'll see in the data model is we see all of our different sets of data that have been added, and we're just seeing a sample of the sets of data. I can of course scroll down if I want to see more, but it's not actually loaded everything just yet. And what I do want to do is I want to switch into diagram view. Now in the diagram view, this actually lets me build relationships between the tables. So if I drag my transactions, which is my fact table, into the center, and I can drag these other two tables across, and if I have a look at these tables, I can then build a relationship between them based upon the data that's in there. Now for a relationship to exist, there has to be a field in each of the tables with some sense of commonality. So an example of that might be here with the cashier table. I have cashier ID, and here I have cashier ID on my transactions. So the transactions are the fact table, if you think back to the diagram I showed you earlier. And these are a record of events. So they are the facts that we've recorded. Now, all of the other surrounding tables, these are lookup tables. So here I have the quantity, which is the quantity of that product ID that was on a particular transaction. Remember that transactions are items swiped through the till, not payment points. And for me to find out the price of that line, I need to find out what the quantity is multiplied by, and from product ID I then need to find the pack price. So I'm going to drag across my product ID over the product ID in this table, and Excel in the data model will look at the relationship between the two. It will look into my products table and work out that every single one of those product IDs is unique. So I end up with a 1 down here, saying this is only one possibility of a product ID, but over here there are many of that product that have been sold. And this will be the same for all of my lookup tables. They will all come from 1 in the lookup table down to many in my transactions table or my fact table. So let me just create the relationships between the others. So payment type, till ID, and I can drag them in either direction. It doesn't matter. Excel is working out which one has the many, which one has the 1. So now I've built these relationships, I can actually go back into data view. Don't see anything about the relationships here directly, but what we do see is on the headers, when I now hover over one of these headers, it tells me the column that it's related to in the table where it is related. I'll just close this down, and where this really helps is that I can now use the field from my products to drag down in here as well, and they will be related. But let me actually put it down as makes and put makes down in the rows, and now because I have a relationship between those two tables, I can now see for each of these individual makes how many transactions went through the till. And if you think back to the original question, that was actually pretty much one of the questions, although we do need to see this over time as well. So creating the relationships in the data manager, they're really, really useful. But in order to find out the actual amount of monies as well, we do need to create a calculation. So we're going to do this back in the data model, and we want to add a column into our transactions table, which is our fact table, which is the quantity multiplied by the pack price. So I just click there to add a column, and then I just start typing in, and if you notice the formula bar, it works the same as in Excel, but I need to specify what this column name is first of all. So I'm going to call it line total, and I'm going to say this line total equals, and I can just come across here and click, and it will select that column and the table name to go in there, and it's that multiplied by. Now what I want to do here is I want to effectively do a VLOOKUP, and I want to do a VLOOKUP for the product ID from my product table, and then I want to return a certain column value from there, which is the pack price. So here I'm going to type in related, which is the command I use here for effectively a VLOOKUP, but based upon the relationship that I set up in my diagram view. And I want to find the relationship from the table products, and I want pack price. Not pack quantity, but pack price. Okay. And this should now build me an entire new column of data telling me the values of the quantity from this table and the matching pack price from the product table. Now this is an amount of money, and at the moment it's just formatted as a decimal. I want to change this into pounds, and that then formats it as money. So here you have your formatting, and the great thing about this formatting, as you'll see in the next step, is unlike normal pivot tables, this formatting feeds through in Power Pivot. So if I were to now put in, and this is on my transactions table, and right at the bottom I have my line totals, and if I now put line totals in there as well, I end up with a sum of line total, and it is fed through as money. So this is a breakdown per till, showing me the number of transactions, or per make of till, the number of transactions that have gone through the till, and a sum of the amount of money that's gone through the till. Pretty much the answer we wanted. All we need to do now is put in some kind of timeline on there, or use time on the axis of a chart. In order to do the same for the cashiers though, we need to do a little bit more work. So I'm going to go back into the data model, and we're going to have a look at the cashiers, and we need to work out what category they fall into, whether they're new staff, medium-term staff, or long-term staff. We don't have that information, but what we do have is the start date. So I'm going to add a column, and I'm going to work out how long they've been with us. So length of employee, and again I really need to learn how to type. Length of employee, and this equals today. Now start typing in today, and just like in Excel, it suggests the command. Now it's today minus the start date. Now it puts in the start date. Now actually I want this divided by 365, but if I just put it in like that, it will take the start date divided by 365 and then say today's date minus that, which is clearly not what I want. What I actually want to do is I want to put this in brackets so that today minus the start date is worked out first, and then the overall number of days that they've been in our employment is divided by 365 to give me years. Now again, that's not quite what I want, so I'm going to just press enter so you can see how that comes out, and you'll notice it comes out with lots of decimals. Now actually that's no use. What I want is I want the integer, in other words I just want the first bit of that, and I don't want it rounded, I just want the integer, I just want to ignore all the rest. Because if somebody has been with us for 13 years and 11 months, we're going to consider that as 13 complete years, not quite 14. So kind of like someone's age, if you're 13 years and 11 months, you're still 13, you're not quite 14. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that calculation and we're going to wrap it in another one, and we're going to say equals int. Now just watch what happens when I select the int option here. So I'm going to press tab to select it, and you'll notice that it has used the bracket that I put around the today. Now if I were just to go to the end and put a bracket on there, firstly I would now have one too many close brackets, and you can just see that I've got the red error coming up underneath that bracket. And the reason is it's actually now using one of these as the closing bracket for there. I need to put in the open bracket again. Now when I click OK, it will give me the integer as whole numbers. Now based upon there, I need to create another new column which will give them categories. Now I'm simply going to use if for this because I've only got the 3 categories. I could quite easily use substitute if I wanted to. So instead here I'm going to use experience, and I'm going to say the experience equals if. Now if that column there is, let's say, greater than 5, then we're going to say experienced. Otherwise, if that column there is greater than 1, let's say medium. Otherwise, new. And you'll see that the people who've been here more than 5 years, they're coming up as experienced. The people who've been here short term, in other words less than 1 year, sorry, not greater than 1 year, so less than 2 years, they're coming up as new, and others are coming up as medium in between. Okay, so what we can now do is we can group by these categories within our pivot table. So I'm just going to minimize this down. We'll go back to our pivot table, and you'll notice every time I come back from the data model to the pivot table, it's refreshing the data here. I'm simply going to create a new pivot table over on the right. So insert pivot table. I could just do Alt-N-V because I have my hand on the mouse. I'd use the mouse. And again, I'm going to say table tills make. In fact, no, I won't. I don't want table tills make. I want employee. So cashiers, and I want experience. And then down here, I want quantity, in other words, how many items they put through the till. And I also want my line total, how much money they put through the till. So here I essentially have the answer to my first question, which was, can I show my makes of till, number of items they put through and the amount of money, and my staff again with the same values. Now almost always you wouldn't create this with pivot tables. You'd go straight in and create pivot charts. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to make a new sheet, and we'll put the pivot charts on this new sheet. A couple of things to look at when we put in a pivot chart. So first of all, I'm just going to say insert pivot chart. A lot of people think you have to start a pivot chart from a pivot table, and you don't. I just click straight up there on pivot chart. Again, just like with the pivot table, it says use the data model and put it on an existing worksheet. Now this is the bit that doesn't work properly. If I just click down here saying I want my pivot chart to go there, when I click OK, it just goes where it wants to anyway. Not to worry, I can always reposition it. And if I hold down Alt as I'm repositioning it, it snaps in to cell sizes. So that's a useful trick to remember as well. Now what I can choose with the chart is I could choose the same fields that I brought down. So let me just do this for one of them first of all. So we'll do it for the makes, and I'm going to say, in fact I'm going to drag the make up to the legend, and we're going to do our transactions again, and we're going to do quantity first of all. So this is showing me make in the legends and quantity of transactions there. Now what I could do is say, actually I want to see this as a line diagram, but what that will do is give me individual points at the moment, because what I'd like is line over time. So I'd like to see how these tills are doing over time. So I do have a date field there, but if I just use the date time and insert it in there as the date time, I will end up with about 90,000 instances of possible days. That's clearly not what I want. So Excel does something very clever. Watch what happens when I drag date time down into the axis. It will automatically create groupings, and it does take a few seconds because it's adding in extra columns, and it's grouped by the various different months or years. So I can drag this down and see it by year, And of course I can then say, well, in 2020 I've got an anomaly because I don't have a full year's worth of data there, so I can always come up here and filter out 2020, or I could have done that on here on the filter as well. Both of them work exactly the same. Okay, and again, this type of chart here, as I said, we don't want to see it like that. We'll change the chart type into a line diagram, and now we're seeing each individual model over time. And I can see pretty much straight away that my Casio is doing pretty well, and that this one here, which is the SAM4, is probably reached the end of its life. It had a good period then, but now the performance is dipping off, so the tills may be starting to wear out, whereas actually the Casios are seeming to do very well overall. And bear in mind, this is based upon the number of transactions, not the amount of money. Now if I wanted to do this as an amount of money, the easiest way of doing this is simply to make a duplicate of this chart. And the best way to make a duplicate is to select the chart and go as if to move it, but then hold down the Control key, and if you also hold down Alt, it will snap in to the cell sizes, so I can end up with the two immediately underneath as a duplicate. And then all I need to do here is take out the sum of quantity, and I need to put in the sum of the line price. Now I'm just going to create another little chart here just to demonstrate something, because this is not quite what we want. This is misleading data at the moment, and some people may have already picked up on this, but what we're actually seeing there doesn't actually show us the performance of the tills. What it shows us is the performance by make. But if I go down here, for example, and just put in quantity, and then put in makes again, this is showing me the quantity of transactions, the number of transactions per make of till, but nowhere is this working out how many of each of these tills I have. Now if I drag down make into the values, this does show me a count of how many tills I have. So if I were now to sort this one, largest to smallest, I'll be able to see why my Casios are performing so well is because I've got more of them. My SAM4s are not doing so well because I've got about sort of 30% fewer of them anyway. So yeah, it makes sense that that number is smaller. What we'd actually need to do to fix this is, normally in our pivot table we'd come up here and create a calculated item, which would be the sum of quantity divided by the count of make. Now we can actually do this off to the side. We can click off to the side and use get pivot data to get the numbers from within the pivot table. But what's much easier to do is again to do this in the data model. So I'm going to go back into my data model, and back on my transactions sheet, this area down the bottom is where we create the measures themselves. So the calculated columns go into the table. The measures, which remember I said are the global ones, they just go in the bottom in the calculation area, and we can turn this on or off just with a button at the top of the screen there. So I've turned on my calculation area, and now here I'm going to create a measure which works out the sum of quantity divided by a count of make. So this measure here, and I just type it in, and I'm going to say this is average transactions by make, and this equals, so it's the sum, and I just start typing in sum and it gives me that. And I'm going to say sum of quantity. Now rather than just clicking on quantity down there, because I don't know where that quantity has come from, I am going to make sure I specify the actual table. So it's a table transactions quantity. So it's the sum of that divided by a count, and I want count of, and again I'm going to look down for table tills make. So this is average transactions by make is a sum of transactions quantity divided by count of make. And this will give me a single number in here, which is absolutely fine. That's what I want. But if I expand this column out, you'll see that that particular number is a decimal number with loads of decimal places, which I don't want. So I'll simply click on there to remove the decimals. Let's do another one down below. So we're going to say average pounds by make, and this one equals, and it's very similar, so it's a sum, but we don't want the sum of the quantity, we want the sum of the line total, which is this one here. So because it's over here and I can see it, I can just click on it and it will put in that field for me. So I want that divided by a count. Now you'll notice that it comes up with count of make. Now this is because the calculation has already been done, so it already has that count of make in memory, and so it doesn't need to do the calculation again, it just refers to the same value it got last time. That does save a little bit of time, particularly when you're talking about a huge number of calculations. Now bear in mind this particular one is an amount of money, so this time I need to change that into money, and we'll see that we have average number of transactions just under 10,000, average amount of money just under 100,000 per till. So if we now go back to our pivot table, we don't need this one anymore, that was just to demonstrate the point, and so I will delete that. And what we can do is over here we can just change these values. Instead of saying sum of quantity, I can go back into my transactions table, and because I created these measures on the transactions table, this is where they appear. So I'll say average number of transactions rather than total number of transactions. And for this one, I don't want the sum of line total, you've guessed it, I want the average by average pounds by make. So now we're seeing a bit of a more realistic picture. We're still seeing that the Casios are doing well, but it's not such a notable difference anymore. Although we are also still seeing that the SAM4 and the Sharp are probably underperforming, particularly the SAM4 where they've dropped off considerably. We could do exactly the same here now for our till operators, for our cashiers, and let's do that first of all. We don't have the measures yet, the average figures, but we can always build them afterwards just as we did here. So insert, and rather than inserting, I'm just simply going to select both of these by holding down the shift key in between select. And now if I click and drag as if to move and hold down Control and Alt, I can snap those two in. And now if I click away and back on that one, I'm going to drag off average by make, I'm going to drag out make, I'm going to replace this one with the cashier's experience, and down at the bottom in my transactions I'm going to replace this with quantity, and again this is the overall quantity, not showing divided by how many there are, and there are far more in the experience category, and that's why they're showing a much higher performance. And you'll see how that changes when we fix this and make it average. Down here again we're going to take out the make and the average by make, and we're going to put in our cashier's experience, and this is going to be line total, But again, we want that to be average of amount of money, because again, it's distorted by the fact that we have more in the experience category than either of the other two. So once more, we go back into our data model, and we can simply click down here, and we're going to put in average transaction by cashier, average pounds by cashier. Similar calculations to do here for these measures. So average TX by experience, and this equals the sum tab, and we want the sum of quantity, and again I'm just going to make sure that I use the right one, so sum of table transactions quantity divided by count, and we want count of experience, so table cashier's experience, and again it will give me a figure with decimals there, and again I can just click up there to remove the decimals. Last one to do down here, average pounds by experience, and this equals the sum, and it's the sum of transactions line total divided by count and it's count of cashier experience. Now this again is line total is an amount of money, so I want to format that in pounds. And again we'll just switch back to our Power Pivot, and for this one here I don't want the sum of line total, I actually want the average pounds by experience, and for this one I don't want the sum of quantity, I want the average transactions by experience. And you'll notice that these charts are now much more closely matched, and that the experienced are actually not doing as well on average as the others, but I have far more of them. So you'll see there how actually by not understanding the data properly, by not having these measures built in there, you can end up with some very distorted figures for your summary. What we now want to do is we want to add in a slicer where we can use the state field, because every single state has its own state manager, and so that the state managers can analyze this data for their specific regions. I've just dragged down the row height there, just so I've got some space to put a horizontal slicer at the top. Now at the moment I can come over here, and I don't have the data for the stores. I do have some data for the customers, so I can go to the customers and I can pick out the state name for the customer, but this is not necessarily the same as the state for the store that they bought in. So I am going to have to import another table, and I'll do this using my query editor again. Now I'm not going to do it directly from here. There is a way of getting data directly into the data model. I could also just use the query editor that I've shown you before. So I could go in and say get from data sources here, but it's easier to use one or the other and just be consistent with that. So let's go to the data and say new query, and it's going to be from a CSV, so comma separate values, and this is the store data. Now once more we are going to have a look at this. We are going to edit it rather than just loading it. We do want to make sure that the headers have been promoted. Yep, so the headers have been promoted. We do have the right types up there at the top, so the query is looking good so far. And we can now just say yep, close and load to, and we want it loaded to the data model again with just a connection. Now, one more thing that we do have to do, we do need to go into the data model and set up a link between the stores, or some kind of relationship between the stores and these. But let's just have a look, before we do that, let's have a look at why we need to do that. So I'm going to go in to Analyze, and I'm going to say Insert a Slicer. And I don't have the option here for my stores, and the reason is because I'm only viewing the active fields. If I said all, then I could get the data from the store. Now if I do that, I can say yes, okay, and I create a slicer, not by the store name, but actually by the state name. So Analyze, Insert Slicer from the stores by state abbreviation, let's say, and click OK. And now I've got my slicer. I'll just make it much wider and then increase the number of columns. What should I say, 23. And I can put it at the top there. Oh, it doesn't like me putting it at the top. And this is not actually connected to anything yet. Sorry, it is connected, but it has no relationship, so it has no way of actually running the filter. So if I say filter by California, it does nothing to any of these. Now it's only actually connected to this first report, and if I click on Report Connections, I will see the chart number 1 that it's connected to. If I just check all the other ones, it will be connected to all 4 of these charts now, but it doesn't know how it's related to them. So for example, if I click on New York, it's not showing me the data. So here I do need to go into the data model to set up a relationship for that extra table that I've added in. It's very simple. It has store ID in it. My transaction table also has store ID, so I just simply link the two. I link my fact with the store ID to the lookup with the store ID, and now it will be able to relate the state or the state abbreviation from that lookup and compare it with my facts. So let's close that down. It's updated the data. These are now showing me by New York or by California. Sometimes you do have to click on it a couple of times to make it refresh quickly. Bear in mind that it is looking at a whole load of data in order to do this. And what we can see here is, for example, that our medium term employees were doing very, very well back in 2015, but then they've been through a rocky phase. And it might be that we didn't have a very good training program in place. Overall, signs of improvement in 2017, 2018, that's a good sign. That means that our training program that's in place is probably working. What we might need to look at is, are we forgetting about the experienced people? Are we ignoring them in the training program? Because again, they were doing very well, but they're beginning to tail off. So we can also analyze our tills, and we'll look here and we'll see that, for example, this particular brand, and if I click on it and then hover over it, it says the Toshibas. We've actually stopped using them in New York. We stopped in 2018, so we've got figures for 2018, but nothing going forwards. And our Casios are once more doing very, very well, flying ahead of all the others. So this lets us see the data that we're asked to analyze by the measures that we were asked to analyze. We're seeing it: number of transactions by make, number of transactions by experience, amount of money by make, amount of money by experience, and we're able to filter it down with a certain level of granularity. Now there may be instances where I'm going to be exporting this file and I absolutely don't want to be sending my customer information with this file, but I might want to be able to do some analysis. I might want to see the customer state up here rather than the store's state. So what I would do is I would go back into my data model, and I can do this. I'm just going into data model to have a look at it, and we will see that we have a relationship between our customers and our transactions. So again, in the diagram view, we have a relationship between our customers and our transactions. But what we don't want to do is take all of the information from our customers, because a lot of this is sensitive information that we don't want going outside the organization. But we can just take one field from here and add it on to this table here. So what we're going to do is we're going to do that in our initial query, and then we're not going to include this table with our data model when we send it to someone else. Now we do this in the query editor. So again, I go to data, show my queries, and I'm just going to double click on my transactions by year. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a column here, which is the state, and it's the state again depending upon the customer ID, so it's the state from the customer file. But I'm not going to do it by creating a related column. I'm going to do it by merging two queries together. Now this is really just to show you how to use the merge queries feature. So if I click on here to say merge queries, it comes up and says clearly I want to merge this one with some other query. The other query is going to be the customers, but I don't want all of the information from customers. And before I even do that, I need to say that actually how are these two related? Well, it's customer ID and customer ID. Now what is it that I actually want? Well, I want left outer, so I want to keep all of these transactions. Yes, I do. So I want all from this one, and then I want to just show the matching with the others, because I may have customer IDs in there who haven't actually bought anything, and I don't want those extra customer fields coming in here. I only want the customer details where there is a matching transaction. So that's fine, and I'm going to say OK. But then it says, oh, do I want all of the data from these? No, I don't. So I'm going to click on that double-headed arrow, and now I can actually choose what data is being selected. So I don't want to select all columns. I just want the state data to come across, and I'm not going to use the original name, otherwise it comes up with the name of table customers and then the details, and I'm simply going to click OK, and then when it comes in I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to call it customer state. Now two places I can rename it. I can rename it here, or I can actually rename it up here in the M code or the query code. Customer state. And as I do that, you'll notice where it changes it, and if you're not sure, then do change it here first of all, because you see state in twice, and what it's doing is it's getting from table customers state and it's saving it as customer state. Okay, what I could now do is use that query, and let me cancel that, I should have loaded, so close and load. Once I've loaded it already and said load to, I don't from then on need to define where I want it loaded. It will always use the same settings to load. So it's now loading again. And I could now put in another filter by customer state as well, so I could see where the customer state matches the state abbreviation for the stores. We're now going to take a look at using one of the other Power Tools, which is called Power View. Now you do need to have got your data in using Power Query first of all. You do need to have used the data model to actually create the relationships and any measures or calculations that you need to have done. So Power View is just a different way of displaying the information rather than using Power Pivot, and it is quite a lot easier to use, quite clearer to see what's going on. Once we've had a look at that, we'll also have a look at Power Map, which is this 3D maps up here. But what we do need to do before we start is we need to make sure that we've got these add-ins enabled. And the way we do that is we go to File and Options and then Add-ins, and they are COM add-ins. So when we see the COM add-ins, we need to click Go. And just check that you have your Power View and Power Map ticked. Clearly you need to Power Pivot, otherwise you wouldn't be able to do what we just did. Click OK. Now additionally to that, what we need to do is we need to add a button somewhere that lets us actually create a Power View. It isn't there to start with. If I go to Power Pivot, there is nowhere. If I go to Insert, there is nowhere by default to insert a Power View. So we're going to customize this ribbon. So I right click and I say customize the ribbon. And I'm just going to do it on my insert ribbon, and I'm going to say insert a new group. And this new group I want to rename, and I'm going to call it reports. This is kind of standard. Most people call it reports. And then on reports they'll put the command which is not on the ribbon, and just click down in this area here, I for insert, and I come down to insert a Power View report. Click OK. Now what I get is I get an extra group on this ribbon. So on my insert ribbon I get the extra group which lets me insert a Power View. Now one thing to be aware of with Power View is that you do need Silverlight installed in order to be able to see the views, and this applies to Power View and Power Maps, most specifically Power Maps, but it is also for Power View. So if you are going to be using this, you need Silverlight. Another thing to be aware of is that Silverlight is not supported on most modern browsers, so certainly if you use Chrome, you're not going to be seeing the reports that you've created in Power View. You might want to use Power BI Desktop instead. Let's have a look at how this looks. So if I click on Power View, it actually adds in an extra sheet, which is a Power View sheet. It's called Power View 1, a very imaginative name, and you would probably go down there and rename the sheet first of all. It does come up with the Power View fields that I can use, and all of these are the fields straight from my data model. So all the calculations, the measures, everything that I've put in there is the same as is in my data model. So very easy for me to actually build a Power View just the same. Almost like a pivot table, except I don't need to drag anything down into specific areas to start with. Let's just say we want to take our tills make. I'll just tick the make. And what happens is it goes across into a view and gives me a unique list of makes. And if I now say, let's show me the average amount of money by make, it then puts a list. And this is a pivot table. I can change this into a chart very simply by clicking on a chart type. Now what this will do is it will show me the view that I've chosen, or the visualization that I've chosen for the object that I had selected. So I can click on there and have an object selected. I could say other chart, line chart, and it transforms that into a line chart. Now as soon as I've chosen the different types of visualization, I then end up with the different options for the values down here. Now I might want make to go in the legend because I want something else, like for example the year field, to go on the axis. And that now shows me a very similar chart to what we had before, just in Excel on sheet 2. Now again, I don't want to see 2020, so a couple of ways I can do this. I can come across here and put a filter on, so add to filter view, or I could come across straight here to my filter view, and in this actual icon, if I click on that show filters, then it will show the filters in this filter view, and I can then edit the filter to not include 2020, just like we did before. The reason was because 2020 was distorting the data, because it was such a low figure, because we don't have all the data yet for that year. Once more, you can see the Casios are flying ahead generally, but not by too much compared to things like the 3Ms and the HPs. If I want to create another visualization, I just click away in empty space. Yeah. If I want to make one similar to this, what I can't do is click and drag and then use the control key like we did before, but I can just simply copy and paste, and it will go in as an exact copy of it. And I say an exact copy, assuming there's enough space for it. If there wasn't enough space, it may have shrunk it down slightly, and that may cause some distortion in the way the labels appear. Now for this one here, this is average pounds by make. I don't want that to be average pounds by make. I want that to be average transactions by make. And you'll notice that I can't just drag this one out from here like I do with a normal pivot table. I do need to click on the drop down and say remove the field, and then I'll choose average transactions by make, and it goes into the same field. Yeah. So that is a slight difference. Actually, you do get used to it, although you saw that I didn't. I tried to drag it out myself. I could create these same two tables down below for the customers. I won't do that for now. What I am going to do is just click down below and drag on the state from the stores, and let's again drag on the state abbreviation, and it just goes in as a big list, and I want this list to be a slicer, and this is now giving me the slicer, which lets me filter by state, and I can reposition it. If it lets me drag it, I can reposition it where I like, and I can change it into a different type of object as well. So I could change it into a table, for example, or a matrix, which just lines them up. However I choose, these are all still just slicers. So all of these elements, even though this is not specifically a slicer, I can still click on California and it will filter the other elements by California eventually. Equally, I can click on one of the objects in a chart and it will filter all of the other objects by that thing that I've clicked on. Let me make that back into a slicer, and you'll be able to see the things that I've got selected much more clearly. But every element within your Power View, every element effectively becomes a slicer. If I want to clear a slicer, I do need to come up for the slicer itself. I need to come up and clear the slicer filter. If I've chosen a chart element, I just need to click in white space within that chart that I've chosen the filter on. Let's add in a map. So we want to drag in stores, and we want our stores, let's just drag in the latitude, and we want to convert that into a map. And so it will give us a map view down here, and we have our latitude in lat. Clearly we want the longitude in long, and it will now be able to plot the positions of the stores based upon these two figures I've given it. We do need a little bit more information, so I'm going to scroll right the way down, and I'm going to say that actually what we want is we want our locations to be by, let's say, quantity. In fact, no, we don't. We want the size to be by quantity. And it should be now plotting all of those positions across the states by the quantity within those individual locations. It does take a while for this to work, but what you'll see is you do end up with much better visualizations in the Power View than you do just on a sheet. But don't use this just because it's a little bit gimmicky. Use this because it does what you want it to do. Problem comes when we try to output this. So if I now say File and Export, it's telling me how do I export it. So the example would be a PDF. Now, if I export this as a PDF, I have active elements here that won't work. So my slicers are not going to work. Equally, my scroll bars are not going to work. So you can't scroll up and down in an element on a PDF. So this is quite limited when it comes to being exported. But it's done for a specific reason. This was created for sharing within the SharePoint environment, and it does work quite well at that. Let's now just have a look at Power Map, which is another similar feature. So again, I'm just going to say Insert, and I'm going to say 3D Map, and it opens up 3D maps. Now, this is purely for mapping. It's not going to show me the charts like that. It is going to show me my data on a map. Now, there's a couple of annoying anomalies with this, first of all. So if I click there to close that, I can add the fields directly from here, but as soon as I click on Add Field, it quite often pops up with that field list again. So if that does annoy you, do just close it down each time it appears. And I want to have my location data. I'm going to say latitude and longitude, and then I get the option, how are these positional data? So I can choose that the latitude is the latitude and the longitude is the longitude, and as soon as I've specified that, it's now plotting all the positions, which is what it was doing in the map view in Power View previously. It was just seemingly taking forever to do so. I can equally scroll this globe around just by left clicking and dragging. I can zoom in just with the mouse wheel, and I can hide the tour with the various different scenes in it just by closing that down temporarily. I can also tilt the globe, and I can also view this as a flat map at the top. So sometimes a flat map is preferable to a globe. Particularly of interest is when you zoom in on it, you get more levels of detail from these map tiles. Now, because I'm choosing a map view, I get the option for various different fields down here. So the height, let's click on there and say that actually what we want is from our transactions, we want the average money by make. In fact, let's do the average transactions by make. So this will show me how many items go through a till. And this legend that's appeared, I'm just going to resize it, but I'm going to leave myself enough space for the three items, sorry, the number of items down here that we have the number of tills. So there's about 6 different tills. I am going to shrink it down so I don't need to see so much space there. The reason I want to do that is because down in the category, I want to see the make of tills. So I don't want stores, don't want cashiers, don't want customers. I do want the tills, and I want the make of tills. So now I've got individual coloration for the makes of tills. I didn't leave quite enough space there, and that's great. So this is now showing me, and I could also add a filter field. So I could go down to filters and add a filter and say by state. Now, what this doesn't let me do, so if I come down here and choose, let me say California, what it doesn't do is automatically reposition the map for me, showing me just California. Now, that would be great if it did. What it does do is clear off all of the others, so it's now just showing me California, or I can see California and Florida, or one or the other. For our instance, we'd probably want to see one or the other, and we can now zoom in here to see some level of granularity, and it's showing me the store locations and the performance of the various different types of tills within those store locations. Now we can change this at any time, so I can go up away from my filters. I'll leave the filters on as they are, but I could change the category and the make. the height there, and I can now change the height to be the cashier's performance, basically. So this is the average, and it's the average transactions by experience for the different cashiers, and then for my category I'll put in the experience of the cashiers. So now I'm seeing color coded with the new staff members, and they're the big purple bars, and actually they're doing quite well. Medium is doing next well, and actually we're seeing that our experienced within Florida are probably not doing very well, certainly in these coastal regions here, but further north they're actually doing fine. So our experienced are doing pretty much as well as the others. But it would be very store specific, and again we could apply more filters, but we don't have the option for slicers here. And when we save this, it tends to be saved as a video and not as something that's interactive for people to look at. When we want to save this as a video, we add movement on it to make it look like it's interactive, but do bear in mind this can be a little bit gimmicky, and we do actually want it to be interactive rather than just having it look nice and pretty. If I go back in and show my tours, on the left hand side this is the scene, and I've only got one scene in here, but let me just change some of the scene settings just so you can see how it works. And we have a transition duration. I'm going to change that to 10 seconds, and I'm going to give it a circling round effect. In fact, no, let me give you a figure 8, one that you'd never actually use. And let's apply that. And now let's have a look at the tour. So we'll play the tour, and you'll see that it's actually giving me a figure of 8 spinning around Florida. And as I say, this is one that you'd probably never ever use because you get seasick watching it. We can also save this as a video. Now if I say create video, watch and see, I'm going to choose the smallest possible settings, and I'm going to say create, and bear in mind this is a 10-second video, so I'm going to just put this on my desktop just so we can easily play the video afterwards, and I'll leave it called the default, so tour 1. Now as I said, bear in mind this is a 10-second visualization, and it is in the lowest possible file quality, and the machine I'm using is an i7 processor, 8 GB of RAM, and has a solid state drive, so it's a fairly fast machine by laptop standards, and it still takes ages and ages just to process 10 seconds worth of video. So if you had half a dozen different scenes down here with long visualizations, you probably want to leave it running overnight on most machines. Is that worth it? Almost certainly not. So let's give this a few seconds, and as soon as it's finished I'll click open, and what that will do is it will play the video in my default player, which will be VLC, and you'll be able to see how the visualization is created. Now when I was running it initially, you saw it was slightly jerky, it was going step by step. When I'm actually playing the video itself, it'll be much smoother, and so we see the video itself playing much smoother, but you can see the quality is less. So it's doing the figure of 8, it's whizzing backwards and forwards across, and really that wasn't worth the wait. Personally, I think the maps, the 3D maps, are a bit of a gimmick. I'm not a huge fan of them. I don't think they're worth the extra effort, and there are professional tools out there for creating visualizations of data on maps. MapInfo is a classic one. Excel is not there yet. However, the features in Excel have got considerably better over the last few years, and within the next few years MapInfo might need to look over their shoulder and see who's catching up. We're going to leave this now, and we're going to close Excel completely, and we're going to have a look in Power BI Desktop. And in the Power BI Desktop, what we're going to have a look at is all of these things that we can actually pretty much create exactly the same, but we have very many more options for sharing. It's much more versatile for sharing, and it certainly helps working in Power BI Desktop if you've got a background from Power Query, because a lot of the getting data in and manipulation is exactly the same. Okay, so we're now going to open up Power BI Desktop, and this is a separate program that you will have to install, and that might be an issue for some people who are on corporate servers. You do need to get permission to install it, obviously. It is free software though, so it should be available through your IT department. There is a pro login. It's a subscription that you need to do some of the pro features, like for example sharing once you've published it. There are ways of getting around that using the free version, and I'll talk about why you shouldn't use them, because you'll end up sharing your entire data model and your entire data set on the internet for anybody to use. Now, it's not listed, but it is searchable, and it's certainly findable on Google and Bing. So just be very cautious about trying to get around the paid methods. And it's not linked to the same data model that we created in Excel, so we do have to rebuild the data model from scratch. So let's go in and start doing that. Let's get data first of all. So we're going to get data from a folder. So I click on here to say get data. I don't see folder in this initial list, so I just click on more, and folder will then appear in the next list that appears, and I say get from folder and connect. It then comes up and says, well, where is the folder you want to get it from? So I'll browse to the desktop, and I have the folder there, and I say OK. It now has a look in that folder and shows me very similar to what it looks like in Excel in the Power Query, because actually the Power Query is the engine that drives this whole thing here. So I'm going to say edit, because remember we want to make this folder future proof. We want to make it so that if somebody adds in an extra file type later on, then that's not going to be loaded. If somebody adds in another CSV, then it is loaded. And again, we need to go to the extension, right click and say transform to make sure that these are in lowercase. Once more, I'm not changing these to lowercase, I'm changing my view of them to lowercase. I'm now going to click on the drop down. I'm going to apply a text filter, and again I'm going to do text filter equals rather than using the check boxes, because again if I just unselect all and then select CSV, the machine records me selecting everything, selecting all rather than selecting just the CSVs, because there is nothing else in there at the moment. So I'm going to say equals, and once more, just like in the Power Query, I can click on the drop down and say equals.csv, because that is a file type that is already in there. If there was a different file type I wanted, I could type it in. I'll click OK. That's now filtered to see just each extension CSV. Now what you may notice is that this is all going into here, and I can see that that is making it lowercase, and that is now looking for where the extension is the CSV. And I now don't need any of this metadata anymore, so just like we did before, I can click on there, say remove other columns, and then expand this one out. So as I say, this is just like the query editor in Power Query, and people who are familiar with using that will find this very easy to use. It has promoted my headers. It's shown me the first couple of 100 rows, and I click OK, and this will now expand out my content, so I'll be able to see, and this is now showing me the first 1,000 rows, and it's using the first 1,000 rows and it's analyzing the data types within these rows. Now there's an extra feature here which is fantastic, and this is when I click on here to do with date time, I could actually specify this using locale. In other words, if my source data comes from SAP and is in German date time format, I can say that the source uses this locale, and I could say it's datetime German format, and it will then translate that into my regional settings local time format. So I'm going to say it is a date and time, and it comes from the locale of, I'll just say G, scroll down to the Germany, and I'll be able to see what that input would look like for date time. And you notice that it is with a dot separator instead of with the / separator. So it will be transforming it from the locale that the data is already in into my own local regional settings. And that's fantastic, saves a huge amount of time. What I had to do previously was I had to split the column using a delimiter, and the delimiter I had to know was the dot, and it would then give me day, month, year, and then times, and I'd probably split that separately using a space as a delimiter, and I'd then split the time again using a colon to actually give me the difference between the hours, the minutes, and the seconds. Absolute pain to do, certainly doable, and once you've done that, you then have to join them all back together again to give you the regional format that you want. Saves a huge amount of time having it in there as a locale. These are pretty accurate, but you might need to check them because, for example, all of these things, all of these IDs that we're using, they've all gone in as numbers. I probably don't want them all to go in as numbers because they're codes, they're lookup codes rather than actual numbers. So for now that's fine, we're going to leave them as numbers. If you remember in the query editor, what I had to be careful of doing was saying close and load to, because I didn't want it loaded into a table in my workbook, and I needed to select the fact that I wanted it loaded in the data model. Here I don't need to do that. I just say close and apply. It's automatically put into the data model because there's nowhere else for the data to go. The apply part of this is if I had any visualizations on my screen, it would now be applying the changes to the queries that I'd made to those visualizations. Now I haven't used any visualizations yet, so there are none. I'm now going to get data from an Excel spreadsheet, just like we did before. And again, it's looking at that spreadsheet for all of the different range objects within the spreadsheet. So this could be things like print areas, tables, or sheets themselves. The difference here is I don't have to tick a box to say, let me choose more than one type of thing, because clearly I want to choose more than one type of thing. If I went down to edit, I could have had them all selected and gone down to edit and then put a filter on for where the type equals table, but we don't need to do that. I'm just going to go straight ahead and say load. I don't need to go into edit because they don't have file extensions or anything like that on there that I want filtered by, but I could do that. I could say go into them where they're not a sheet object, where they are just a table object. It's loading all of these as separate tables, so these are now all separate tables that have been loaded, and I've got one more to get, so I'm going to get my CSV, and this is the stores data. Once more, I'm not going to go through editing. I could do, but I'm happy with the way the data is there just in the preview, and I'll just click load. I'm going to end up with all the various different tables in there. Now, what we had to do previously was we then had to go in and manage the relationships, set up the relationships between all of these tables before we could use them. The clever thing about Power BI is if I click on here, it takes me to my relationship manager, and we'll see that it has already created the relationship between all these tables. So it's looked at the data within the tables, and it's made its best guess at how they're linked together. So what it's determined is that all of these around the outside, these are the lookup tables, and in the middle it's put my fact table, which is exactly what we want. So in the middle is my many, and around the outside are all my ones, which are the lookup tables. Now this is what's called a star schema, and it's the most common, the most efficient type of data model to work with. And this is not the whole of the data model, because I still need to put my measures in the data model. And the measures are the same as they were previously, so they're the calculations, and it's calculated columns that I need to add in to find out what the line total price is, and I need to do calculated measures, which are working out the averages for the customers, sorry, for the staff, and also per till by make. So let's have a look at how we do that. Now it's really useful to just click between these buttons here rather than to have to close down a separate part of the program and go back to another separate part of the program like we do in Excel. Let's create a visual first of all. So let's try and create a visual first of all. So we want to expand these two, and we want make and we want quantity. Now again, what it's giving us is effectively a pivot table view here, and we didn't need to create the relationships, remember, they were already done for us, and we're seeing our data there. Now the text inside there is too small to read, so if I want to change the size of the text, I just click on the paintbrush here, or the paint roller here, and I'd choose where the size is. Now just to make it easier for me, if I click in the search box there and type in size, it actually filters all of the sub menus and only opens them up and shows me the things that include the word size or whatever I've filtered for up here. So I'm looking for the values text size, which is these items in here, and I want to make them slightly bigger. So if I click on there, I'm making the values text size slightly bigger, so I can make it more readable. I might click on the column headers text size as well and make them more readable also. So just that little trick, it is worth filtering just so you can see the specific commands that you want down here, particularly when you're doing the formatting. And we'll do that later on when we want to see orientation as well. We do need to bear in mind once more, this here is not realistic data, in that this is showing me the total number of transactions or the total number of items by make of till, but it's not giving it to me as an average because I have more Casios than I have of any of the others. So obviously the Casio amount would be bigger. So we need to create a measure. Now again, we don't need to switch to our data model to make the measures. We can simply click on the table, so I've got that table selected, and that's the table that the measure will go on. Now before we do the measure, we'll go to the modeling and we'll say create a new column. So this is a new calculated column, and it's going to ask me what does the column equal. So it just goes in first of all as column name equals. Now I don't want it called column, I want it called line price. So the line price equals, and this is going to be the sum. In fact, it's not going to be the sum, it's just going to be the quantity multiplied by my product pack price. So it's however much I've got in the quantity multiplied by the pack price. Now we do have the relationship there, but we need to be careful that we say related pack price. I'm going to come back in here and click on there, finish typing it in, and what you'll notice is I can't just come down and click to select, because that won't put it into my calculation. It will then show me the calculation for the one I've clicked on, kind of like in Excel when you click on different cells. So I want this to be my line price. I don't want it to be my line price, I want it to be the quantity. So I'm just going to type in QTY, and you'll see it has actually picked up transactions by year quantity, which is absolutely what I want. So I want that multiplied by REL for related, and what is it I want related? Well, it's the pack price, so I do PRI and it comes up with pack price. And this will now give me an extra column in here, which is my line price, and I can now tick that one as well, and I'm seeing the line price, and it's giving me the sum of line price here, and this is the sum of quantity by make. Yeah. Now again, these are not quite what I wanted, because I need actually to work out what the averages are by make. So this is our measure, so I'm clicking on there, so I've got transactions by year, this is where my measure is going to go. It doesn't actually matter when I'm doing measures, obviously it matters when I do calculated columns, but it doesn't matter which of these data fields my measure goes into. So I'm just going to say new measure, and it's asking me what the measure is called, and I'm going to say this one is average transaction by make. And the average transaction is the sum, and it's the sum of my quantity. Now I'm not just going to click on quantity there, I'm not going to click on it there, I'm just going to type in QTY, and again it comes up with transactions by year quantity, and it's the sum of that divided by a count of make, so MAK, and it comes up with table tilde make. So these code prompts are really helpful when you're working in the code itself. This will now, when I press enter, it will now create the extra measure, and you'll see it's a calculator, a little calculator icon telling me it's a calculated field. And now I can make sure I'm in that field there and add the average transaction by make, and you'll see the average transaction. Now again, I can go into that field there and say this is a number of transactions, so I don't want all the decimal places. I can change this down to no decimal places, so it's showing me an average number as a whole number of decimal places. I don't need these other two now, so I can untick quantity and line price. I'm just seeing the average number of transactions by make, which is what I want. I now want to put another measure in there, which is the average amount of, in other words, amount of money of transactions by make, and it's a very similar thing. So I just make sure I've got my transactions by year selected, new measure, and this is average pounds by make, and this equals the sum, and it's the sum of line price, and it's that divided by a count of make, and this in itself is an amount of money. So I click on the drop down and I'm saying this is an amount of UK pounds, and I can now also use that in my makes. Just like we did previously, we can change the view of this, so we can change the view of this visualization, so I could change it into a line chart and see the data as a line chart, and whichever visualization I choose, I end up with different fields down here. So I might say for this particular one, I don't want the average by make, and you'll notice that just like before in the Power View, if I drag them off to the side, they don't disappear, but I've now got a handy little X I can click on the right hand side just to remove it. So this is the average number of transactions by make, and I can put some various different filters, not filters, but some different values in here. So my legend, I want to see the make, let me take it off the axis first of all. I drag it into the right place, and on my axis, and here's a clever bit, if I go into my transactions by year, previously what we had to do when we wanted to use the years, we needed to drag our date time down to the pivot table fields and then drag them all out, and it automatically created a hierarchy of dates. By the fact of it recognizing the fact that they're dates, it's automatically built a date hierarchy in the background. So I can choose by year straight away. So I'm going to drag the year into the axis, and I end up with my year values running along here and my makes by color at the top. Now, just like before, I've got a tail off for 2020. So what I want to see is I want to actually filter that. So I could actually now come down here to my filters, and I can drag a filter field down, and this is my years again, so I'm going to drag my years into the filter field, and then I can choose any one of them. Yeah. And we could also put a timeline filter on, which is actually what I'm going to do because I prefer using a timeline in this particular example. So the way we put a timeline filter on is, remember, if I click in there and choose a visualization, the visualization will change depending on what I choose there. But if I'm clicked in nothing and I then choose a visualization, so I'm going to choose a slicer, it puts an extra one in, and I can now say let's put in the years, and that's gone in here. Now it's recognized it as a year slicer, which is effectively a timeline filter. So if I just resize that, and I'll move this one down slightly so I can put my timeline slicer at the top, and here it shows me my earliest date, there my latest date, and I can change these sliders to change my latest date to be the 2019 instead of the 2020, so I've excluded the 2020. I do have other options there as well that I can click on to change the level of filtering, but a timeline slider is the most useful type. I can also click on individual elements within my chart, and I've grayed out all of the others, and any additional visualizations will also be filtered by the thing that I click on in any one of these individual elements. Okay, we're now going to look at how we can add in an extra element. So do remember that you click in space so you don't have any of these elements selected, otherwise when you change the visualization you won't be adding a new one, you'll be changing the one that you've got selected. So I'm going to click on a map to put in a new map, and because I have latitude and longitude for my stores, I'm just going to click the check boxes there to put them in. Now you do get a message coming up over here because by default it would be doing some aggregation. Yep, so it's automatically aggregated. This is a weird thing and I wish they'd fix it, because clearly if you're putting in latitude and longitude fields you don't want any type of aggregation. If you just read that message there, it will tell you what to do, but basically you click on there and you say don't summarize for both of them. That should be the default. It should know that latitude and longitude fields are numerical fields, but you don't need to summarize them. There's no such thing as the sum of all the latitudes, just like there's no such thing as the sum of phone numbers. Now at the moment it's showing me a certain level of zoom. I can click in my map and zoom in. It does move around if I hold the left key down and scroll about as well, and I can change this visualization by changing the size, and I'm going to change the size here to the average amount of money, in fact the average transactions by make, and then I'm going to change the color so that the colors, not the color saturation, but the legend is going to be done by make. So table tills make, and the legend is done by make. That now gives me little pie charts, and I can now see over here how the different tills are performing in different areas. Let's now click down below and we're going to put in a slicer, and we're going to put in a slicer, and this is going to be by state. We'll do it by state abbreviation because it's just easier to see on here, and I'm simply going to drag that down a little bit and across, just so I've got more space to see my states. But I do also need to change the orientation of this slicer, so it's not running vertically, it's running horizontally, and there's a clever feature here that I'll show you. So I need to change the orientation, so I go into the format for the slicer, and it is under general, but if you don't know that it's under general, just search in orient and it comes up straight away and opens up wherever it finds orientation. So I want this to be horizontal. Now it hasn't just gone horizontal, it's also made it dynamic,
so it's automatically fitted and gone basically like wrap text, as much space as is needed. If I take out the orient, you'll see why it's done that, and it's because underneath the orientation it says it's responsive. If I turn that off, it just goes back to a straight horizontal data set. If I turn the responsive back on, it shows me it as a responsive size. I can change these individual settings now, so I can go in here and say the items, how big do I want them, what kind of text size do I want within the items, so I can make the text size bigger within the items. Clearly if you make it bigger beyond a certain point, it's going to be make these boxes too big to fit within the space that you've got there. Now the really clever thing here is, if I now click on one of these state abbreviations in my slicer, it automatically filters this chart to just show me the performance of the tills by make within that state. But cleverer than that is it also zooms the map and shows me the location of the stores and the performance of the tills within those stores. The other thing I find particularly useful is all the colors are consistent throughout all the elements. So here, that color there is the same as the colors on the map here. If I were to click on that bar, it will only show me the filtered elements in the map, or all the remaining elements. So I'm now seeing a 2-level slicer. If I want to go back to seeing all of the objects, I click in white space, and if I want to clear my filter, I do need to come up and clear the filters up here, using that button there to clear the selections, and it then shows me everything again. If I were to go down to Hawaii, again it just zooms in to show me Hawaii, and it looks like we only have one store in Hawaii, and if anybody's local to Hawaii, you'll actually know what store this is. Okay, let's look at New York, and we'll see it zooms into New York and it shows me the till operations in New York. Just like before, we can see the data shows us that we've stopped using that particular till, if I can manage to select it. That one there, which is my Toshiba. We stopped using the Toshiba in 2018, and for 2019 we have no figures for that Toshiba till. And if I click in there, we clear the selection, we see all of the other tills. Okay, what else can we do within Power BI Desktop? So we've looked at how to create a calculated column, we've looked at how to create a calculated measure. The relationships are pretty much done automatically for us. We've looked at the formatting, and we've looked at how to create the visuals. The thing that's left to do is how to share this with other people. I'm going to go to my home ribbon and I'm going to say publish. Now there are two different options here. What I could do is I could actually save, and if I just save the PBIX file, so that is the file that I can then send somebody else that PBIX file, and provided they have the same links to the data source that I had, in other words if they're in the same organization, then the PBIX file will work on their machine, on their version of the desktop. If however I want to actually publish it so that anybody can view it on any devices, this is slightly more involved process, and you do need an account in order to do this. I'm just going to replace the one I've got there already. It's just an example, and it does save all the visualizations, and I'm going to put it into my workspace, which I would then share the particular file from my workspace with somebody else. It does take a few seconds to do, not very long, but it is refreshing the data before it saves it. It's a step that you don't need to do manually. Once it's done this, I'm going to actually open this in powerbi.com or Power BI Online. So I'm going to open it in Power BI. Now that is not the desktop version, this is the online version. You'll notice it's just coming up in a browser, and it's pretty much works on any browser. It's supposed to be fairly future-proof. It doesn't need Silverlight or any other add-ins in order to run. And we're now in my workspace, and we can see very much the same visualization. However, I'm viewing this as a report at the moment. I do have the option to click up there to go back in to edit the report, and this is now a very similar view to what I had back on my desktop version, except I can now quickly click to reading view to see what it's like from the point of view of the person receiving the report. Everything is still active. I can still click on an element and filter by that element. I can still click in white space and clear the filter. I can still click on my slicers and it will move my chart. I can edit all of these elements just as before, and I can output them just as before. On the File menu, I could save a copy of this report locally in the format that's required for the online version. I could print it. Printing it becomes a flat copy. This is the one you've got to be very careful of, is publishing to web. Just do read this. Embed the report for public access by anyone on the internet. That's clearly not what you want to do if you've got any sort of sensitive information in your report whatsoever. Now, it may be that if you're a council office and you're reporting statistics, you think, well, actually we want public to be aware of these statistics. Unless every part of the data that you've used is already in the public domain, that might be a very dangerous thing to do. Certainly if it includes anybody's personal or personally identifiable information, under the new GDPR regulations in Europe, that would actually be illegal, and there are almost unlimited fines for doing that. So be especially careful before you do that, because what it will do is it will also publish your data set. Export to PowerPoint. This is kind of pointless. I don't even know why this is in there, because it just basically takes a flat picture. Well, it doesn't actually take a flat picture. It exports it as a PowerPoint show, and nothing is interactive. So all of these elements here, which I was quite proud of them being interactive, none of them are interactive in PowerPoint. Everything you click on, it just says sign into Power BI online. Actually, no point at all saving it for PowerPoint. Not until they fix that and make it slightly more interactive within the PowerPoint show. Download the report. This is downloading a PBIX copy of this report so it can be opened in Power BI desktop rather than online. On the view options here, it's strange because these fit to page and options here, they're to do with the whole of the program, but if I want to view just the report in full screen, I need to click on it up here and not in the program itself. So just press escape to come out of that. The other options here for the view, some of these are really useful, like the high contrast options. Particularly useful if people are short-sighted. They can actually use one of these contrast options, and they're quite familiar, but they do rely upon some basic settings not having been changed. So if I've changed some background colors or something like that, they will override these high contrast options. So be careful about using background colors if you have any potential of people viewing it using the high contrast options. Other things I can do is I can go into the actual data within my report, so I can drill into the data, and you do just need to turn these on in order to make it work. The last option I want to talk about here is the sharing option. If I click on share, I do need the Pro version, and I need a subscription for the Pro version, and I'll need to be logged in order for the share to work. I can then, just like I can with any other OneDrive file, effectively, I can choose people to share it with, and they will have access to this file. Couple of other useful things I can show you. I can show you this little happy smiley face. That one is where you give feedback on Power BI Desktop and Power BI Online. If there's a feature you want, tell them through this feedback option. They're very good. Like I say, they are updating this constantly, so do use that feature to ask questions, ask for things that you want in the program. Help is help. It's the same everywhere. This is a way of downloading this, and it's basically the same options as you had over here on the file. The settings are the settings for your login, not just for this report. And this one here is notifications, just an information box, and I shall close that down. This more, the three dots on the right hand side, I think that should actually be showing more. Obviously there are some useful things in there as well, and if you click on there we can say generate a QR code, and this is nice because what it does, it generates a QR code that somebody can scan, and if they've already had permission to view this report, they can just use the QR code, quickly scan it, and it will take them straight into that report. So somebody could, for example, have an Excel spreadsheet with a list of different reports and the QR codes next to it, and just scan the individual reports to go to particular reports in Power BI Pro. You do need to have permission to be able to see the report, so it's not just anybody. The other thing about that QR code is it's great for viewing stuff on a mobile device, mobile phone, tablet. If it's got a built-in camera, you can just scan the QR code and you'll be able to see it, provided you've got Power BI installed on that device. If you don't have Power BI app installed on the device, it'll take you through using your normal browser, but it will ask you for a login, whereas if you've got the app installed, it'll just take you straight into your account. It stores the login details for you. Okay, I appreciate this has been an absolute marathon session. There is lots more to this than I've shown you, but as an introduction, I hope you'll find it useful, and as ever, thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please ask down below in the comments or pop us an email, and anything you ask I will answer.